Hi, everyone. On behalf of HR.com, I'd like to welcome you all to this webcast, Creating More Inclusive Workspaces for Non-Binary Employees, sponsored by HiBob. This webcast has been pre-approved for 1 HRCI credit, so please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credit. It will appear in your HR.com account within 2 business days, and of course, we'll also send you an email with this information. So during this webcast, if you have questions or comments, we ask you to use the Q&A in your webinar controls so that the presenters have access to them. And again, thank you so much for joining us, and it is now my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Raz Nimrati.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. My name is Raz. I am the head of sales enablement and business development over at HiBob, who we're going to talk about in just a second. And again, thank you for having me, and thank you for all our panelists for jumping on. I'll start with a really quick intro of who we are as an organization and where HR is today in today's way of work. HR really is in a fortunate position to strategically lead their business to adapt and thrive as remote and hybrid work becomes the new normal of work, the new normal way of operation. Through guiding and empowering managers to lead their teams, driving communication and engagement initiatives that build strong culture and coming to the table with strategic insights, HR leaders can directly impact the success of the business and solidify their standing as strategic drivers of business and performance. You can see some kind of information just about the way that HR can succeed right there on the bottom by delivering, driving, empowering, guiding, and ensuring. And obviously afterwards, we'll share these slides so you can read a little bit further. I want to take a moment to tell you a little bit about who we are as an organization and what Bob does. So we're a modern, forward-thinking people management platform focused on helping organizations to connect and build culture. We're a system of engagement really designed for that modern, mid-size, and multinational business. And we want to help organizations to both automate their processes, develop their people, connect their teams, and ultimately help to build stronger organizations in a much different way than how HR has been or HR tech has been doing it before. It's robust, configurable, and designed to meet the needs of your business as it grows and expands. So without further ado, I'll give a quick introduction here to all our wonderful panelists on the line, and I'll really let them introduce themselves. So Madison, would you like to kick us off?
For sure. So hello, everyone. My name is Madison. Most people call me Maddie. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am living in Austin, Texas. However, I will never say I am a Texan. I am very much a New Englander. I'm the founder of Blue Haired Unicorn, which is my own consulting firm. And I'm also the VP of people for a startup here in Austin, Texas.
Amazing. Who would you like to kick it off to?
Shannon, you can go next.
Okay, cool. So my name is Shannon Kelly Tratnick. I just got married, so that's why my name is different on here than it is on here.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. So the pronouns I use are they, them, and I am in recruiting, have been in the recruiting space for 3 or 4 years now. And I'm currently a senior recruiter at ThoughtWorks, but diversity and inclusion are topics I'm super passionate about, and I identify as transgender and non-binary, which is why I'm here and super excited to be talking about this topic today.
Well, thank you for being here. Thanks for joining. Michael, last but not least.
Yeah, g'day everybody. So my name's Michael Delaney. My pronouns are he and him. I'm coming to you from beautiful Sydney, Australia, which makes it currently 2 a.m. But this is such an important topic. It's worthwhile being up and about for it. Because let's face it, the best day that we all had to start thinking about better diversity and inclusion was yesterday, but the second best day is today. So I'm really grateful to have an opportunity to be here with you. I am currently the head of talent for a local company here called Human Force, and we do a workforce management platform.
Amazing. Thank you for joining us at such a late hour. I had no idea it was so late, but I guess, you know, with being stuck at home, there's not much else to do anyways. Perfect. And we're gonna have Madison kick us off here on the topic, sorry, of non-binary, cisgender, and intersectionality.
For sure. So I would actually love to have Shannon talk a bit about being non-binary. It's not my space to define it because it doesn't define me, but I would love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. So yeah, we just thought it would be a good place to start to make sure we're kind of all working from the same terminology and ground here. So kind of wanted to start off with a few definitions. First of all, transgender and cisgender, I guess we'll start there. So since non-binary falls under kind of that umbrella of a transgender identity. So again, just as a background, many of you probably already know this. So transgender refers to someone whose gender identity is different than the one that they were assigned at birth. So when you were born and you were a baby, a doctor looked at you and said, this is a boy, this is a girl. Many of us grow up and go, I don't think that was right. So that would be a transgender person. Somebody who grew up was assigned, you know, this is a little girl when they were an infant, grew up like, cool, I'm a girl, I'm a woman, that's totally fine with me. That person identifies as cisgender. It's just a, you know, different word for the opposite of transgender. So transgender, cisgender. Anything you want to add to that, Maddie or Michael?
No, but I'm super happy to touch on the idea of intersectionality. I will probably mention it more than once in this conversation, as I mention it multiple times a day in my real life. And so what we're going to talk about is how our different identities essentially intersect with one another to impact how we navigate the world. And so, of course, when you're a woman, there are tons of barriers, but those barriers just compound on each other when you are a Black woman, or you're a Black queer woman, or you're a Black transgender woman or man. And so we want to really keep in mind that although we all have barriers, we also all have some privilege, and thinking about how we can leverage our privilege and power to uplift and educate and essentially do better.
Awesome. And then to just speak more to the idea of non-binary identities specifically, which is what we're here to talk about today, that refers to anybody who doesn't identify within that binary of like a man or a woman, or male or female. So for some people, that's a feeling of like, I kind of identify as both. For some people, that's a feeling of, I really just don't feel like either of those things are right for me. Some people who consider themselves non-binary consider themselves transgender. Some people don't. That's more around personal preference and like what identity labels you feel like relate to you. Personally, for myself, I identify as non-binary, and I also identify as transgender. But again, some people might not. So other words that you might hear associated with a non-binary identity are things like gender fluid or gender queer, or agender, which is sort of the feeling of like identifying with none of the genders. There are a lot of other things like that as well, but those are kind of some things that you might hear when someone is talking about non-binary as an identity. Some people might also say gender non-conforming. Personally, I don't like the term for myself, but that's another one that you might hear as well.
And it's definitely a very, very good place to start. And I think from there, I'd love to understand, you know, how does this all play a part in HR today? How does this play a part in, and I think we just threw up a poll as well. How does your HR tech support diversity and inclusion, and how does it support the different gender and different identities that are out, that are obviously very important to consider today? So I have the poll up. I'm going to move my share screen so that we can share. And we also had another question from the crowd. So as we wait for the results to come in, okay. So Shannon already responded to the question. Do you want to read that out loud real quick while we
wait for
responses?
A section was explain cisgender again, and I know I talked really fast. So basically, cisgender is just a word for someone who identifies as the gender they were assigned at birth. So for example, a child who was born, the baby was like, or the doctor looked at the baby and was like, this is a boy. And then that kid was like, yeah, grew up. It's like, yeah, I identify as a boy, grew up to adult. Yeah, I identify as a man. That would be a cisgender person.
Thank you for defining and redefining out loud here. So we did throw out a poll to the crowd, and as we were getting answers here, it looks like Does your HR tech support diversity and inclusion? And it looks like 66% of the crowd actually said that it does, which is amazing, and we really love to hear that. I'd love to let me just bring the slides back up here, and I'd love to bring on Michael to talk a little bit about this subject as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think often when we look at anything to do with diversity and inclusion, the default mechanism that we try to do to solve for it, and I say solve with quotation marks, is to get the technology. Because if we have technology in place where we can all check various buttons or boxes, it feels to the business like they've made a great leap forward. And I think on our very initial call, Madison, you were the one who said, you can't really use technology to define human problems. And I think that's definitely something that we face here. Everybody should, though, if they can, certainly evaluate their technology stack to see if it is going to be flexible. Many of you in the audience may have had implementations of big, old school, complicated technology that perhaps is difficult around this, but it's definitely worthwhile doing an audit of your current stack to see if it will support diversity and inclusion. Now, seeing those poll results, 66% saying yes, it does. I think that's fantastic. I don't think I've ever worked in an organization where the technology would support that. So I'm certainly in the 34% category from my past experience. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that technology really can do for you then is it starts to allow you to do measurements. I mean, oftentimes business decisions are driven by what you can measure. If you can't measure it, you can't show that it's happening. You can't show a need for more diverse and more flexible, policies and procedures. So I would encourage everybody out there to go and take a look at their technology. And it's not just your HRIS. It starts in terms of where I look at it from a recruiting lens, from the very beginning of your job postings and your applicant tracking system. Does that system allow people to tell you, if they wish, their identity? Too many of the solutions out there, I think, certainly don't. And I guess the other thing that I would say is you also want to make sure that you leave it open for people to decide what they want to share with you. We often live in a world now where we're saying to people, tell us who you are, tell us how you identify. There are many people who don't want to. They want to keep that identity to themselves. And I think that it can be a very private decision to make. So you need to allow for flexible options for people to present their identity to you. But you certainly should have technology that does allow that. Many of the systems out there, you can at least hard code if you have to, if they don't already come with the capacity for more options than male, female. At least if they've got an other, which is probably a terrible term to use, but at least it gives people the opportunity to say that, yeah, I'm not identifying as either. But go and take a look, and if it doesn't have that, talk to your vendor partner and ask them why it doesn't have that, and ask them if they can work with you to engineer that into your system. Because, yeah, whilst technology can't solve for things, it can certainly help you gain better understanding of your workforce and what perhaps the diversity needs that might exist within that.
Yeah, definitely. And we also had a question come in from the crowd that was right around that subject of tools like background check tools. And I know with our payroll tool as well, that it's really the same, right? There's three options and not much flexibility and really not very correct definitions there. So you definitely responded to that question. And as you said, I think it's not just the technology. The technology is the facilitator. It really needs to be part of the company culture and part of what the organization wants to do.
Yeah, payroll tech is one that's often terrible for that. I know there's plenty of places where if you don't have a pronoun that aligns to what the system says, your pay just doesn't go in, which is obviously an appalling situation. So it's really important to look at your tech stack holistically and go from front to back. And that might be your background checks, it might be your payroll provider, it could be your ATS. But if you're going to do it for one thing, I'd encourage you to do it for all things, because then you can really build that consistent alignment through every process. And it might cause you to change vendors. It might cause you to say to your vendor partners, no, you're not a diverse and inclusive organization, so we don't wish to support your business. We're going to find someone that will.
Yeah, and to kind of jump back to the background check question, because that's a huge, then you're running into issues beyond like what your original company, what your company values are in defining. You're looking at something that's defined by like an external system that you might not have control over. Yeah. To Raz's point about making it part of your culture, you can help. Something that's helpful, even if you have a system that's inflexible, is setting up your employee for a way that when, at minimum, you can acknowledge like, the system is making us do this. We don't like that. We wish it were different. And unfortunately, as a transgender person living this life, like that's an experience I'm very familiar with. And I totally understand like the EEOC wants you to choose a box that says male or female or say like choose not to respond. Like their limitation till the world gets more on board with non-binary gender options in things, like that's just kind of the way that it is. But so like even working within a system that isn't the best system, like you can do things as a human in your organization to set up people who are going into those systems, and acknowledge what you're putting them through, I guess is what I would say.
Yeah, definitely. I 100% agree. I think creating those channels of communication internally, whether it's through tech or through human communication, is extremely important today. And I think it's tougher today because everyone is remote and there's not that human element of going into someone's office and saying, hey, this experience that I went through is really tough. So sometimes you do need to rely on technology to create that channel. And I think later on we can talk a little bit more about which tools the panel here is using to create that environment. We have another question here, and I'd like to open it up to the room. How do I go about introducing non-binary pronouns into my company? I think we can, Shannon or Madison would like to kick us off here.
For sure. So for me, so much of this is about education, and it's about creating spaces for people before they get there. And so being able to introduce people who are non-binary, it's as simple as that conversation, being able to educate people on what we're talking about right now. And it's not an opinion. It is not something that is like up for a debate or an argument, because people's identities are not opinions and they are not debatable. And so when I'm having these conversations with my own organization, it is just as simple as when I'm talking about someone who is cisgender, it's not different. The conversation is exactly the same. And when we're writing policies and different things in our handbooks, we try incredibly hard to be really inclusive of everyone. And so writing policies that work for your most marginalized employee are going to work for the person who has the least amount of barriers. And that's how I'm always trying to frame the conversation with my own organization. It's not that people are weird or that they're different or that you don't believe it. It's just that this is not something you have been introduced to. And it is not your place to decide on what is right and what is normal, because there is no normal. Being hetero and cisgender is not the baseline for normality. It's just what society has ingrained in us, and society is broken, not people.
Shannon, would you like to? Oh, okay.
Yeah. So in terms of like practices around like making sure people state their pronouns. So essentially we're just trying to move to a practice of like everybody uses pronouns. I feel like there's this kind of misconception in the culture that pronouns are a new thing. But I mean, like if I were going to talk about Maddie, I would always be like, so Maddie, she's on this panel with me, blah, 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 blah. Like it's just a part of English. So what we're moving away from is the assumption that we can look at another person that we work with or a customer or someone else and automatically know what pronouns they use. So the things that we want to try to work to normalize are asking what pronouns people use in a similar introductory way as you would ask someone's name. And some practices that also work are like things like right now, like we have our pronouns in our Slack and our Zoom names right now, for example. So you can look at my face having never met me and say, oh, Shannon uses they, them pronouns. Same thing with social media, with email signatures, things like that. So as far as like introducing that conversation, I think the best way to normalize something like that is just to do it. Like the more you do it, the less awkward it feels. And, you know, it is awkward to start with because it's not something that most of us are used to practicing. It's something that's still awkward for me to lead conversations with, like, I use they pronouns, what pronouns do you use? But I think the more we can do it and make it sound casual, the better off that we'll be.
And I think it's also, there's this misconception that we ask people what their preferred pronouns are, and pronouns aren't preferred, they're just your pronouns. And so that's something that I'm also trying to, when people say that to me, I have to, say like, no, they're just my pronouns. they're not preferred. It's not like an option. And, in my own organization, when I'm hiring people, I'm one of those people I really like everyone to feel really awesome and welcomed. So when I'm sending out the email to my company, I'm also including their pronouns. In a remote world, it's really hard because one, you're not really going to see people face to face right now, except over Zoom. And that makes things a little bit harder. And so I want to make sure that from day one, I've made it very clear what people's pronouns are. And this is a journey. There are going to be days where you mess up. My partner is non-binary. I've definitely messed up their pronouns like on our podcast, and we don't take it out because it's important for people to know that it's okay to mess up. It's not okay to like die on that hill and be like, well, I'm not going to use that, or I'm not going to say sorry. It's okay to say sorry and do better the next time. Life is full of messing up, no matter where you are in your DEI journey, and not just with pronouns. But for me, it's really important to at least give the effort of trying and also recognizing when you do mess up.
Yeah, and I would also add that especially in this more remote, more global world, it's really helpful to bring, people's pronouns into the practice there, because like there are a lot of names out there that you may not know, what gender that a name is associated with, because it's not a name from like the culture that you come from, for example. So in kind of those conversations, it can be really helpful to have that as a point of reference as well.
We had we responded to one question from the crowd around normalization, but we had another question, I think that's really relevant to the topic we're discussing now, and it's around someone who's not so comfortable sharing identities. How do we honor that space? How do we address them? What's the right way forward? I can open that.
You just ask. The simplest thing to do with anything is just ask. I mean, I think, Maddie, you made a great point. Like it's become this dark art. Everybody's like, oh, what's your preferred? What's this? What's that? Just ask people what they're comfortable with, what they would like to be known as, and then respect that. And if you do that, then pretty much everything else is taken care of. People want to be seen. They want to be heard. They want to know that, their identity is valid and that they can present that. So whatever it is, ask them and then use that. And,
right.
If you do make a mistake, don't worry. It'll happen, but just be respectful.
And then with that, oh, sorry, Maddie, I saw you just went on off.
No, you go ahead. I'll go next.
Okay. So, and with that also, like, because I think I'm going to make an assumption about the emotional place this question is coming from. If you assume might be, like, if you know someone and you're like a new hire, for example, and you're like, I have reason to suspect this person might be trans, but they're not saying that. I want them to know that I'm comfortable with that so that they could be open with that if they wanted to. If they're not sharing that information with you and they're not volunteering that, go with what they are telling you. Don't make an assumption about like trying to be open and trying to get someone to open up about it, because they have the right to not disclose that information too. So like, I don't go into every single interaction being out as a trans person. I am very open about it on LinkedIn and in some other areas, but like, several years ago when I was interviewing for a job, I might not have been. So someone might have seen, a profile for me somewhere that says they, them, but I might be like saying totally fine with answering to like another set of pronouns in a job interview. And then later down the line say, actually, just so you know, I'm trans, I'm non-binary, I use they pronouns. So defer to what that person is telling you about how they want to be called, what name they want you to use, what pronouns they want you to use, all of those things. If they're comfortable with sharing something else with you at a later date, they will do so. And the best way to make someone comfortable is to just like demonstrate that you have an inclusive environment overall.
For sure. And that's kind of what I was going to touch on. I think for me, the thing is, one, obviously always ask people how they want to be addressed. But as an organization, our responsibility is to create spaces where people feel like they can show up however they need to. And everyone needs to show up differently for themselves. And so some people may want to be incredibly open about their identity and their journey, while others, it's a very personal thing and they like to keep that compartmentalized and very different from work. And so the pressure of being open all the time, some organizations, they want this level of openness that is now it's required, but that's actually not inclusion either. Inclusion is allowing people to show up however they need to, and knowing that you no longer control the narrative of what people bring to work. And I think that's really important to know, is authenticity and truth looks very different on everyone on the gender spectrum in general.
And I think we had another, fairly general question around creating that very comfortable environment within an organization, a supportive environment. Do we have any tips for training managers specifically or recruiters on how to best do that for candidates coming into the organization?
So I have some thoughts on that as a recruiter. I would say at all stages in the process, make gender identification voluntary. Again, I know that we bump into some things with government things like we were talking about EEO forms and things like that. But whenever you can make voluntary to choose a gender, like just think about it when you're collecting that information, like why do you need it essentially? So in the recruiting process, I'm still figuring out like what the best place to ask the question of what someone's pronouns are, but I just like to open up, if you're comfortable sharing what pronouns you use, feel free to do so. I've done that on job application processes before and had positive responses to that. I've also had, plenty of people just choose not to respond to that question, which is totally as far as, other kind of general HR type policies beyond recruiting, I would say, when you're thinking about things, it feels so silly to say this in this virtual world, but when you're thinking about things like professional dress codes, for example, having one dress code that is defining professional dress as opposed to like men should wear, a collared shirt and women should wear a dress that is only, whatever length. This all feels so old fashioned to me working at like a tech company, but I've seen those things before. Like think about if you have that language as part of a professional dress code at this point. I'd challenge you on that. I would also say, look at both your technology systems and also kind of like your policies in place for updating personal information. So if you have systems that are around only using legal names, for example, many people who are transgender, because name changes, having just gone through one for my marriage, can be really expensive. May not have all of their documentation to a legal name that they use and have a preferred name that they use. So making systems as seamless as possible for changing that information in your internal systems, changing that in, for example, an email address, things like that. In terms of benefits, I would think about your parental leave policies and making those gender neutral, talking about like, instead of maternity leave and paternity leave, talking about, because like a trans man can carry a child, like talking about leave for the parent who's giving birth, for example. Looking at your insurance coverage, looking at, does it cover things like hormone replacement therapy? What kind of gender confirmation related surgeries does it cover? Are there exclusions around that? And if there are exclusions around that, is there a way that you can bridge that gap as a company? I know I've seen a few companies out there who have insurance that doesn't cover things for their transgender employees, and they say, we will cover as an additional benefit, up to X amount of money for this gap that our insurance doesn't cover because your healthcare and your well-being is important to us as an employee. Also, I think many things are doing this already, but like language around like spouses, covering a spouse or partner as opposed to, I don't think most people are like still using husband, wife language or things like that, but just being careful about how you speak to those things colloquially. Those are some that I've thought of off the top of my head.
That was great. And to summarize here, so really looking at your entire tech stack in terms of the terminology that's being used, your internal policies, your insurance policies, and benefits that are provided to employees. Those are just some of the tips here around that. Madison, did you want to add anything to that list as well?
No, I was going to say, if you are not remote, we, for whatever reason, label the nursing room as the mother's room every single time. And so for some reason, we've made that gendered, and it's so easy to put nursing room outside of it instead of mother's room. And so that's something we've actually recently done in our office. And it's just really little things that you think need to be gendered, most likely don't need to be gendered at all.
True. Michael, did you have anything to add as well?
No, I was just going to say, maybe a great point, break the gendered habit. We're so used to labeling everything because we feel comfortable with a label on things. Just stop. I mean, as simple as that. If you can find a way to not have a gender lens on everything we do, it would just make life simpler for I think the entire world. Let's face it.
Yeah, and one other
ahead.
thing just related to, because this is related to the HR policies, and I saw it come up as a question as well. One thing that I wanted to touch on is someone brought up the example of someone who is continuously misgendering a person at work, and handle that on a policy from a policy point of view. I would say, you know, to Maddie's point of like, we're humans and we make mistakes, but there is the example of the aggressive person who is doing it on purpose to be aggressive, to create offense, and to like show they don't respect that person. And that should really be treated as any other kind of, you know, action of bias by your HR policies, because you have someone who is, you know, creating, I mean, I am not an HR, you know, legal policy expert by any means, but you are creating a you know, a work environment for your employee that is hostile at that point.
So hard agree. I actually, I have like little to no fluff room on this. I do not tolerate people who intentionally cause harm within my organizations. And I get it. Microaggressions are a thing, and intent and impact are different. However, if you are consistently misgendering someone, the intent is harmful. Whether or not you believe it's because you're right and you don't believe they, them is like a thing in the English language or whatever it is, your intent is harmful. And so I encourage people who have no tolerance policies to actually use them. So often we write these policies and then we never confront them because Joe Bob is a great performer or Sally Sue is related to the CEO. And instead, what we do is we have these policies that protect the abusers, because now they can turn around and say, oh, I never did that because there's a policy and nothing happened to me. So instead, what you've done is protect the people who cause harm instead of your marginalized communities. And that's irresponsible.
I agree. Did we want to add anything else on the topic of policies? Anything connected to time off? Maybe things connected to paternity, maternity leave? Any tips for the crowd? No problem. So I'm going to jump to another question we got from the crowd here as well. We found that many times talking about politics, religion, or parenting is not considered right to do. So why would asking for pronouns be a correct thing to do?
I'll go. So one, talking about religion, politics, and parenting aren't the wrong thing to do. However, parenting, politics, and religion aren't the same as identity. Parenting, religion, politics are choices. Your identity is not a choice. It is just your identity. And so whether that be your queerness or your Blackness, those aren't things that should make you uncomfortable or shy away. And if they do make you uncomfortable, it doesn't mean that they're wrong to talk about. It means you're uncomfortable and you should unpack that. And so for me, I'm often talking about my Blackness. I'm often talking about my queerness because those are things that impact me at work. I don't stop being Black at work. I don't stop being queer at work. Shannon does not stop being non-binary at work. And despite the idea that of those things making others uncomfortable, it doesn't change our position. You don't get to opt out of the conversation, because I certainly don't get to opt out of being Black.
I'd also just like to challenge the concept that talking about pronouns is a political idea to begin with. We're talking about like just the way that human beings want to be referred respectively. It's like the same thing as making sure you get someone's name right, really. Like, we're just challenging the idea that you can know exactly what pronouns someone uses. So for example, I'll just use Raz as an example because I met him for the first time today. You know, had I not met Raz, never seen his picture, you know, never talked to him, there's no way that I would know from his name of Raz Nimrati that he's a man. And, you know, until talking to him, I really wouldn't have known that either. So just to use you for thanks for letting me use you as an example. So I mean, that's really all that we're doing here. Like, we're not running a political campaign.
And identities in general aren't political. Like, queerness isn't political, Blackness isn't political, like none of this is political, because politics and like racism and homophobia and transphobia, I promise you, they cross party lines. So it's not political.
Very true. We had another really excellent question here that I want to open up to the floor. And it's a question that I think a lot of organizations are asking. How do I gain executive level buy-in to a D&I program, even for just recruiting when possibly the executive team doesn't understand the importance?
Isn't that the magical question that we've all been asking all our lives, I think? Education, education, education. You constantly need to be educating and talking and having open conversations. The second thing then is, I mean, we talked about it earlier, is that the technology can be used to measure things. I mean, if you can find anything that you can show as a metric, I find leadership love metrics. You can give them anything that shows a before and an after metric, then you can often get buy-in. But it's about coming at it openly and honestly and consistently. And from my experience, most senior leadership teams really do want to do the right thing. You know, leadership teams want a workforce that's thriving. They want a workforce of people who are being genuinely authentic. And I think authentic is one of the words that you'll hear used a lot as well today. We want people to have the opportunity to be their authentic selves at work and to be given an authentic opportunity to come as they are. And the more you go to your leadership team and have that conversation, the more buy-in you will get. And then you can go deeper. There's tons of studies out there that show economic benefit from having a more diverse and inclusive organization. So if nothing else fails, show them some dollar signs, and suddenly management teams are falling all over themselves to be the most diverse and inclusive place you can imagine.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer. I'm going to skip to a question from a totally different perspective. So we've been talking as people who are fully, I guess, past the candidate stage, already employed within the organization. But I'd like to take it back for a second to the experience as a job seeker. And I think a lot of people are also going through this today. So the question is as follows. As a job seeker, are there ways we can advocate for our gender and identity needs, health insurance, for example, without outing ourselves? What are some red flags to be aware of from recruiters or HR reps when asking those probing questions? I'll start with Madison on this one.
So I think it's important to remember that you're interviewing them too. And so I think we're really conditioned to be really grateful when someone wants to interview us or hire us. But it's really important for us to ask the questions that matter to us. And so I'm cisgender, but I am Black. And so for me, a lot of the questions revolve around how are you supporting your Black employees through societal trauma? And as a queer person, I'm asking about your parental leave policies and all of these other things. And so I think it's so important to take a step back and really think about the things that you need in your next organization and be able to put them on the table. And so that can just be around healthcare, and it doesn't have to be gender specific or anything like that. You can just be thinking from a how inclusive are you conversation, because that matters. And it's, for me, one of the things I'm asking in general is like, how inclusive are you? And I would say one of the red flags is when people like don't answer you, like they like skirt around your question and they give you some answer that you're like, I don't think you said anything. Did you say something? Watch out for people who cannot give you direct answers around what inclusion means to them, because an organization that is truly inclusive is going to have an answer for your questions around inclusivity.
Yeah, I would plus one that, having been both a trans job seeker and as a recruiter answering those questions, I would say, when people ask me a question about like how diverse company is your company, how does your company handle diversity, things like that, like I want to be very real with the person answering that question that like we haven't solved every problem and it's not perfect, because I think if anyone did say that it's perfect and they've fixed it all and there's nothing to worry about, that would be a red flag to me. That would show to me that they don't know what they're dealing with and it's not important to them and they haven't thought about it, to be completely honest. So that would be one thing. I agree with Maddie's point of you can totally, if you're not at a point where you want to be out in the conversation, like people are asking about diversity and inclusion more and more from an ally perspective during interviews as well. So I would not worry that it outs you to ask those questions and say, look, this is something that's really important to me. This is something that's really important. Work culture in 2021, what are you doing to be inclusive, for example, to trans people, to LGBT people, to Black people in your organization in the current moment. I've asked in interview, in the offer stage, like give me kind of as much information as you possibly can about your healthcare policy. And like, if I need to call people at that point at the provider, I will. It really is, it stinks as trans people that we have to do that legwork. It is such a pain and it's miserable. But like, I haven't had any resistance of like, here's our benefits contact, here's our policy documents, like look for what you need. Because I could be asking about like cancer treatment or something like that. That would also be none of their business, So those are some thoughts that I have on that.
Yeah, you both bring up incredible points. And I think an interview in any way to an organization is a two-way street, right? They're interviewing you, you're interviewing them. I think it's also completely appropriate to ask to speak to someone who's working in the organization or reach out to people that are working there on LinkedIn and have a conversation, talk to them about how they feel the culture is. I think it's very, very important. Michael, anything to add on this topic, on just from the perspective of a job seeker, what to look out for?
Look, no, I definitely concur with what's been said. Ask, if nothing else, ask about inclusion, what inclusion looks like, and that'll tell you a lot. And then if there's other questions that lead on from there, you'll get sort of triggers that you can follow up on for sure.
Amazing. And I have two questions that are referring back to our kind of first topic of conversation, which was more around the definition. So I want to make sure we redefine here both the term of intersectionality and the term of queer. So Madison, do you maybe want to kick us off on the intersectionality?
For sure. So intersectionality was a phrase coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. There are three kinds of intersectionality. The first one being structural, which is how do your identities intersect with one another to essentially how you navigate the world. So for me, I am a Black queer woman. Those are my identities. That's how they intersect. That's how I show up in the world. The next one is political. And so that's about how your identities intersect with political policy, government, laws, things of that nature. And then the next one is representational. So how are your identities portrayed by media? So for example, queer folks are hypersexualized in media. So people's general perception of queer folks is hypersexual. Perception of Black women is that we're angry and Black. And although sometimes I am angry and Black, that's not like my state of being. But because we're represented in society that way, that's how we're perceived. Because so many people have never had an interaction with a queer person or a Black person, they're reliant on how they see us on TV, on radio, and on the internet.
Anything? Oh, okay, thank you, Shannon.
Oh, and then so someone was asking for the definition of queer. Did we do that?
I did not do that.
Okay.
Let you do that.
So in shorthand, and there's a whole bunch of different ways to define queer, so I'll just start with kind of like the shorthand way, is essentially another word to talk about being LGBTQ, so lesbian, bi, gay, transgender, that is more of an umbrella term and that is more like without identifying with one of those specific letters necessarily. It comes out of having originally been used as a slur against us that we've reclaimed and said, no, this is a word that I feel is powerful and I want to use, and I feel like captures the multitudes of identity of gender and sexuality. But so when you hear queer, often people are using it as a shorthand for like LGBT.
Thank you both for defining that. And I think we had a few questions in the chat here around not just workforces within the US, so international workforces. What are, I mean, obviously there shouldn't be very much difference in the culture, right? I mean, the same type of culture we're trying to build here in the US should be the same internationally. Michael, maybe you can speak a little bit to this topic. Anything that you could add in terms of maybe in Australia, how the topics are discussed differently or looked at differently?
Yeah, I think international is always an interesting challenge because different countries are at different stages of their awareness and acceptance and openness to this kind of, diversity and inclusion across the board. So you want to, I think, try and apply the most diverse and inclusive model that you can, wherever that might be, and be consistent. As an organization, you can choose how consistent you wish to be, right? So you shouldn't be going, okay, well, we're going to have one policy for Australia and then another policy for Canada and then another policy for the UK, because fundamentally, as an organization, your policies should be consistent across. Now, there's going to be legal requirements that you have to deal with in different places, but the way that you approach diversity and inclusion should be contingent across every area that you're in. It may mean that in some countries where you're aware that culturally these topics are harder to address, that you have to do more education. But if the answer is more education, then that's a great answer. And I think more education should be in every country that you're in, because we can't assume just because you happen to be a company that's, say, based in Canada, which is a very, open and tolerant society, that the company that you're with is going to be open and tolerant. So I'd say on an international basis, just treat it the same, be as open, as honest as you can, and continue to review and educate at every single stage, and you shouldn't have any major issues.
Thank you for that. And I think Shannon wanted to give a little more clarity specifically towards the insurance policy topic.
I also wanted to add on to Michael's point about international companies. As someone who's working at a global company now, actually fairly new to it, but we have an LGBT affinity group that's based out of India, for example. We have one out of our office in Europe. We have one, one's associated with different offices in the US, and the struggles that those groups bring in are different struggles. So, I mean, I think you want to have the culture and the expectations of like inclusion within your company being the same across the board, but you do have to think about the fact that like there are different contexts and there are different struggles and there are different things that might be like a policy battle here that we're having that they're not having somewhere else, and vice versa. For example, in the UK, there's an extremely like strong anti-trans backlash going on. So like being aware of some of these things that are going on where people work is important to just be aware of if you have a global presence. But yeah, to talk about the insurance question. So there was a question I think is a great one about specifically like how can you support employees with the medical benefits providers? I think anything that you can do to put it not on the trans employee to understand the insurance policy is super helpful. There are people who go to school for a bazillion years to understand all the ins and outs of insurance and copays and deductibles and, what is covered and what is not covered. And like, if you can be a resource to your employee to understand what your policy does and be willing to help make those calls if they need to reach out to someone around like, hey, I'm going to my doctor for XYZ, I need to know if it's covered. If you're willing to be an ally in that, that is a huge help. Because it's hard. Insurance is confusing for anything and everything. The more you need to use it, I feel like the more confusing it gets. So, and then if you have something that's coming up that, is an issue that you need to push back on with your insurer, or come up when you're open to like start thinking about choosing a different plan in the marketplace, like being aware of those things and being able to bring them to your insurer. Again, I'm not an HR policy person, so I haven't been in those conversations around like choosing the company's like employee policy, but like saying, for example, like we really need this to have our, for example, because this person brought up gender specific procedures, for example, we really need preventative care to include, pap smears for everyone who has the anatomy that requires a pap smear, as opposed to like just people whose like identification says that they're women, like that's an important thing to demand of the marketplace too, if that makes sense. Basically, be empowered and knowledgeable and share that knowledge with your trans employees, because we're doing this on our own, on, support groups on the internet and things like that. And the more help that we can have to understand insurance and fight with it if necessary, the better.
And I know that shopping for insurance is a daunting task, and there's like no way to say it, but it straight up sucks. But when you are shopping for insurance, please ask the questions like you're hearing from Shannon. Think about your most marginalized employees. Think about the employees who are nothing like you and what they may need. So often we think about, all right, well, what does like the immediate, like, what do I need? What does my partner need? And that's how we think about, these things going into conversations, but really think about what people need And those people are the marginalized folks in your organization. And so that is like mental health care. That is all of the things that we kind of put on the back burner because they're the hard things to shop for. And I know that they're hard. And I know that there's no fun way to go about having the conversations with carriers, with brokers. But I promise you, it empowers your people to be their best selves and it keeps them healthy.
I think you defined it perfectly. It does suck. That was the right way to define it. Amazing. So I have one excellent question here, and I think this is a good place also to end our Q&A here. But obviously, I know we have a lot more questions, so hopefully we can do. It seems like we have enough to also do a full another hour or so just to continue the conversation here. But we did have a question around ERGs. So one from the crowd. Our organization has very active ERGs, which all have been created by and for employees. However, we do not have an LGBTQ plus ERG. I am aware that we obviously have some members of the community in our organization, but none have brought up starting the ERG. Would you suggest that we wait until someone comes forward, or do you think it's on HR to start that group? We don't want members of the group of the LGBTQ plus community or of the employees of the organization to feel responsible for taking that on if they do not want to, but my colleagues are hesitant to create the group from our side. Any thoughts?
I think it's as easy as asking if they want an LGBTQ ERG. ERGs are kind of this like weird blurry line where of course they're intended for community, but they end up being like your company's educational sphere. And that's not what they're for, because that's emotional labor and emotional labor shouldn't be free. So if you intend on having your ERGs educate your company, pay them. And when you're not expecting that and you want them to just be able to have community and be able to talk about the things that are going wrong at your organization or things that could change, please empower them with a budget. So for me, I think it's really more about asking your LGBT folks if they want an ERG. Sometimes it's weird to be the person to start it. It feels awkward, especially when it doesn't already exist. So it may be that there's some fear around being the person to raise your hand. No matter what kind of marginalized group you're in, it feels weird to raise your hand, especially in a large organization. And if chances are, if you have ERGs, you're probably pretty big. So my thing would be, I would, ask people if that's what they want. And if that is what they want, help them start it, because starting is the hard part.
Yeah, and for anyone who doesn't know the definition, so ERGs are employee resource groups. And any tips on how to ask? Because I know that's also sometimes tough today. So you said asking your employees, Madison, any tips there?
So I think, and I obviously don't have a great idea of like what other ERGs you have as a total company, but it may just be an email that goes out to anyone else that's looking for an ERG that maybe doesn't exist. And it may be that you get answers that aren't LGBTQ, but at least gives people the space to, one, tell you what ERGs should exist that they're looking for. But it gives people a way to volunteer without having to go ask for it. When you're in a marginalized group, you don't want to consistently ask for more at work because you always feel like you're putting your job on the line when you become a burden, even though that's not what it is and that shouldn't be what it is. Sometimes that's how it feels, and we always have that fear that we're going to be that person that, well, they complain a lot, they're asking for too much, and now that's going to hold us back from being promoted. So I think for me, it's really about asking your whole organization what they want and what they need. And if your LGBTQ folks want that and need that, they'll speak up if your organization has made them feel safe enough to do so.
Yeah, that's extremely critical. Forms of communication or creating that channel of communication is critical, whether it be in anonymous surveys or through technology or whatever it may be. And we talked about a lot of different subjects today, which I think having that channel of communication for employees to go and speak to is super critical, whether it's around the policies, insurance, hiring, questions asked in the technology, forms that need to be filled in, whatever it may be. This is, I think, a really easy first step that any organization who's on there at the beginning of this to go ahead and set it up. And I think there's definitely a lot of tools out there, but even just a survey, anonymous survey to the people can sometimes kick off the conversation. Perfect. So I think we have a few more questions, but like I said, we're coming up on time here. I want to thank everyone who's on the line with us today, all the panelists, and obviously all the participants as well. It was a real pleasure to start this conversation. It's really not anywhere near the end. There's a lot more to talk about. So hopefully we can do many more of these sessions. There is going to be a survey sent out at the end, but I want to very, very quickly talk a little bit about talk a little bit about one technology out there that can help you to do a lot of the things we spoke about today, which is Bob and where we started our conversation today. And so one of the things that we spoke about was having technology that allows employees to really either choose to identify or not identify. And if they do, then creating all the options out there, whether it's around things like gender, we talked about spouse, we talk about dependents, and ultimately Bob is one of those tools that can definitely help to do that both during the hiring and afterwards. And also we can always create the environment to choose to either share that out if someone wants to or not, right? So if you want to identify or don't want to identify, I think it's important to allow the employees to decide that later on once that is either collected or not by the system during the hiring and afterwards. We have a lot of incredible dashboards to help to understand better what our organization looks like, to break down things like our dashboards around whether it's retention, turnover, even things like survey data, performance data by the information that we're collecting. And finally, when it comes to creating those ERGs that we spoke about earlier, the system can allow to do a lot of that, whether it's something that's employee-led or created by the organization. We do have an entire tool to allow it to do that. This is accessible to all employees. It does feed into tools like Slack and does allow for those social clubs and clubs around ERGs to be maintained by the employees or by anyone who wants to be part of that in the organization. So we've kind of taken all our questions for today, but I again want to say thank you for everyone. Thank you all for jumping on. Please add all the amazing panelists here on LinkedIn or wherever else you'll find them. Check out Maddie's podcast. Maddie, do you want to give the name here? I know you answered.
My podcast, well, it's not mine, it's my partner and I's, but it's called Bye Bye Binary, and it's just byebybinary.com.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. There will be, as I said, a poll at the end, and I'm pretty sure that there's a recording going out to anyone who missed any piece of this or wants to hear more. So check that out afterwards as well.
That's great. I'm
I
going
believe
to launch.
that there's also some resources going out, right, to folks who are signed up to it with like just kind of some guidelines and follow up on some of these questions, like defining terms and some of the things that people are asking for in terms of getting more education on that topic and recapping some of the kinds of inclusive policies and things that we talked about. I believe that will be going out too as a reference point.
Yes, we're getting a shout out from the marketing. So yes, this will be going out. Sorry.
Okay, great. On behalf of HR.com, I want to say thank you so much to Maddie B, to Raz, to Shannon, to Michael, to all the folks at HiBob. Excellent presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I've got to see the comments come in and the questions through the Q&A, and people just really appreciated this. So thank you so much. I'm going to run a few polls here, but as mentioned earlier, there will be an exit survey. It's going to open in a new browser. I put the link in the chat, and if you can just take a moment, your feedback is very important to all of us. So just take a moment to fill that out before you head on to enjoy the rest of your day. As well, the recording will be available on hr.com shortly, and we will send you an email with a link to the recording, and as well your credits. They'll appear in your hr.com account, and the email will include that as well. All right, and you can go with closing comments, folks, as you want, if you want, as I close this out. Just one more poll.
Well, I just want to say thanks everybody for being here. I know this is this topic, it means a lot to me to see so many people show up with interest in this topic, I would say. So, because I don't know that I would have seen that to be the case a couple of years ago. So.
Agree. All right. Take care, everyone.